Stanford University.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Charlie Younkerman. I'm Dean of Continuing Studies and a member of the program committee of the Stanford Historical Society. And it's on behalf of both of those organizations, Continuing Studies and the Historical Society, that I welcome you to tonight's program on Freedom Summer, commemorating the 50th anniversary of what is widely regarded, rightly, as one of the most consequential moments in the history of the American civil rights movement. I'm just going to say a few words of welcome, introduce our speakers tonight, tell you the game plan, and then turn the podium over to Doug McAdam, who will moderate tonight's program. In 1964, more than 1,000 college-aged, primarily white Northerners joined thousands of mostly black Southern civil rights workers in Mississippi and Louisiana in a massive drive to register African American voters. Over the 10 weeks of the project, the volunteers were victims of random shootings, more than 1,600 arrests, 80 serious beatings, 4 deaths. 37 churches and 30 homes and businesses were bombed or burned. It's well known that the violence was perpetrated by white racist vigilantes and terror groups, often organized by the Ku Klux Klan and in collusion with local law enforcement. In spite of the violence, Freedom Summer volunteers taught in 38 freedom schools and assisted the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged the all-white delegation in the 1964 Democratic Convention. Though Freedom Summer did not succeed in registering many new voters, it brought nationwide attention to the injustices that African Americans had endured, and it profoundly changed the lives of those who participated in the South. This program brings together 4 committed activists and scholars, some of whom participated in Freedom Summer in 1964, others who have studied it and analyzed it extensively and written eloquently about it. The program will be moderated by Professor Doug McAdam, sitting here on your far left, politically and local, situationally. He is the Ray Lyman Wilbur Professor of Sociology and Director of the Program in Urban Studies at Stanford. He's a leading scholar of American social and political movements, is the author of a dozen books, including the prize-winning Freedom Summer, and the forthcoming book with this title, How Did We Get Into This Mess? Race, Region, and the Role of Social Movements in Today's Divided America. Joining, I actually think I have them in order, remarkably. Joining Doug tonight is Professor Claiborne Carson, also a colleague here at Stanford, Professor of American History, actually recently chaired as the Martin Luther King Professor, and the Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. Clay was a civil rights activist and anti-war activist before he became an academic. In 1985, we're both about the same age, so he'll forgive me that slip. He was selected by Coretta Scott King to edit and publish her late husband's papers, in which capacity he has supervised the publication of 7 beautiful volumes so far, with another 6 in the works. His first book as an historian of the civil rights movement was In Struggle, Snick and the Black Awakening of the 1960s, and his most recent book is a memoir, Martin's Dream, My Journey and the Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Marshall Gantz is senior lecturer at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He was a Freedom Summer volunteer in Macomb, Mississippi, helped organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and stayed on to become field secretary for Snick before moving to California, where he worked with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers for 16 years. After another 10 years of organizing work, he returned to Harvard in 1991 to finish some uncompleted business, namely getting his undergraduate degree, which he did in quick order, received a PhD, and joined the faculty of the Kennedy School, where he is now. He is credited with devising the grassroots organizing model that led to Barack Obama's presidential victory in 2008, and is the author, most recently, of Why David Sometimes Wins: Leadership, Organization, and Strategy in the California Farm Workers Movement. Finally, Mary Elizabeth King, Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University for Peace, affiliated with United Nations, and Distinguished Fellow in Oxford of the Ruthermore American Institute. Mary served for 4 years as a staff member of Snick in Atlanta and Jackson, Mississippi, after graduating from Ohio Wesleyan in 1962, an experience that she chronicles in her prize-winning book, Freedom Song, A Personal Story of the 1960s Civil Rights Movement. She's acknowledged as a founding activist of the women's movement, applying knowledge of practical participatory democracy that she acquired in her civil rights work. That's it. Thank you. You're right to applaud because we have a remarkable evening ahead of us. And before I turn the podium over to Doug, a few housekeeping reminders. Turn off your mobile devices. Tonight's program is being videotaped and will be uploaded on Stanford iTunes in a few weeks. It's also, I believe, yes, KZSU? It's working. Okay, we've also got a feed to our own KZSU radio station. Consequently, during the Q&A period, we're going to ask you to use the microphones, and they will be passed, the 2 mics will be passed by volunteers from the Historical Society. Just raise your hand if you have a question to ask, and they'll get you a mic. And finally, before you leave tonight, out on the table, if you're not a member of the Stanford Historical Society, there are membership brochures out there for you to take. The Society is open to anybody who cares about and has affection for Stanford University. You don't have to be a staff member or a faculty of the university. And even if you're not a member, you're welcome to our annual meeting on May 13th. The speaker this year is President John Hennessy. 5 p.m., May 13th, just go to the Historical Society website and you'll find all the information. One last plug. This summer, Clay Carson is teaching a course on Martin Luther King for the Continuing Studies program. You all got one of these along with tonight's printed program, so take it with you and hope you consider joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the course this summer. And now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Doug McAdam.
Thanks, Charlie. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me start by thanking Charlie and also Suzanne Abel. Where's Suzanne? This was their inspired idea for the panel, and I thank you for that. I also must say it is a genuine privilege to be on a panel with 3 such inspiring and accomplished people. Parenthetically, it's also really fun to be the youngest person on any panel at this point. So, and I didn't know Clay's like 194 apparently. So, all right. So our focus tonight, as Charlie said, is really on the ongoing impact, the enduring importance of the Freedom Summer Project. And I was not in Mississippi that summer. I was 11 that summer. I do have one personal memory from that summer of that project that I will share with you later. But I have no personal reminiscences, obviously, of being in Mississippi. I think you're going to hear more from some of the other panelists about personal impacts. But reflecting my long-standing work on social movements and a particular interest in kind of America's racial politics, I want to talk about what I see as the extraordinary significance of the Summer Project for an understanding of the structure and character of American politics, not just then, but now. As deeply divided as we are now, I think the origins or the crucial pivot point in the 60s that started us on this road actually is 1964, with Freedom Summer playing a major part in that story. So that's what I want to focus on in my remarks, is again, the enduring importance of Freedom Summer for an understanding of contemporary American politics. I will proceed by offering a broad brushstroke version of one of the central arguments of the book that Charlie mentioned. The title is actually changed. It's called Deeply Divided: Racial Politics and Social Movements in Post-War America, which is coming out in August with Oxford University Press. The motivating question underlying the book is very simple. How did we go from the striking bipartisanship and comparative economic equality of the post-World War II period to the unprecedented economic and political divisions that characterize contemporary America? The story is complicated. The story I try to tell in the book is complicated. There's lots of factors, lots of change processes that together shape that transition. But tonight I'm going to focus on one that probably comes in for more attention in the book than any other, and that is a fundamental shift in what I call the racial geography of American politics. This is a process that runs through the 60s and beyond, indeed is still with us. This shift in the racial geography of American politics produces a whole series of very important effects that we need to understand if we want to know how we got to where we are now. Three effects in particular I want to stress. This shift transforms the fundamental character and structure of the two major parties in the United States. It breaks apart the New Deal coalition, which had allowed Democrats to dominate federal policymaking from 1932 to 1968, the most sustained period of liberal federal policymaking in the country's history. Finally, this shift sets in motion a regional realignment of American politics that will in time serve as the electoral foundation for a resurgent and increasingly conservative Republican Party. Before I actually talk about the shift and the dynamics that drove it, I want to just pause, because it's worth reminding ourselves just how different the two major parties were circa 1960, on the eve or at the beginning of that decade. The Democrats remained a very strange coalition of Northern liberal labor Democrats, essentially like the Democratic Party of today. But the other part of the coalition were Southern segregationists. The party, its geographic kind of center of gravity was in the South, and reflecting this strange coalition, it was deeply divided, one might even say schizophrenic, on the issue of civil rights. Simultaneously housing within the Democratic Party both the most liberal and conservative members of Congress on the issue of civil rights. For its part, the GOP was centered in the Midwest and the Northeast, the northeastern United States, of all places, with virtually no presence whatsoever in the South. The South hated the Republican Party because it was the party of Lincoln. And at least in the aggregate, the Republicans were dramatically more liberal on issues of race and civil rights than were the Democrats. Oops. Don't believe me? Here's some evidence that this is the voting, partisan voting on the 1957 Civil Rights Act. This was the first piece of civil rights legislation to come out of Congress since the end of Reconstruction. It was a weak bill, but symbolically very important. And here's the voting in the House and Senate on that bill. As you see, the Republicans, it carries because of overwhelming Republican support. The Democrats are deeply divided on the bill. So the Republicans, again, in the aggregate, are much more liberal on matters of race, civil rights, than the Democrats as we head into the 1960s. So those are the two parties, in overbrief thumbnail sketch, but the parties look very, very different circa 1960s, certainly than we think of them today. And as we head into the 60s, two linked struggles in that decade, the civil rights movement on the one hand and the white resistance movement to the civil rights movement, are going to change fundamentally the structure of American politics, and these two parties in particular. Let me start with the civil rights movement. Reluctantly, I should say very reluctantly under JFK, and then much more aggressively under Johnson, the Democrats moved sharply left in the 1960s under the unrelenting pressure of the civil rights movement. So the Democrats are being pushed left on the issue of civil rights by the force of the civil rights movement. This winds up angering and alienating the southern wing of the Democratic Party, the so-called Dixiecrats, and it occasions in 1964 for the first time the loss of the Deep South by the Democrats. Again, the southern white voters get over their long-standing hatred of the Republican Party and for the first time vote Republican. This sea change in American politics is captured in two electoral maps from that period. These are really quite striking. This is Eisenhower's victory in 1956, a landslide victory. The map of the United States is red with the exception of the solid Democratic South. They will not vote for a Republican Party candidate. Here's 64. This is Johnson's landslide win in 64. The map is blue. We'll ignore Arizona for a little bit. But the map is blue with the exception of the Deep South. The white South, again, gets over its longstanding hatred of the party of Lincoln and votes Republican for the first time. Things are shifting, and they're going to shift even more in a very big way. Freedom Summer, the Summer Project, had a lot to do with this. This was not the only factor, mind you, but it played a significant role. Let me focus on that part of the Summer Project that I think really is relevant to the story I'm trying to tell tonight. Johnson takes office, obviously, in November of 63 after Kennedy is assassinated, and very quickly Johnson signals that his central legislative goal is passage of the Civil Rights Act, which he represents as a kind of tribute to our late martyred president. So he aggressively signals that he is going to push to get an even stronger version of the bill through Congress. He knows that's going to antagonize the southern wing of his party. He is hoping to hold this strange coalition together in 1964, so as he's signaling his legislative priority with the Civil Rights Bill, he's also communicating indirectly to the major civil rights groups and in asking them to honor a hiatus with respect to major civil rights campaigns in 1964 in the run-up to the election, understanding that to the extent that there's major racial unrest in the country, this will more likely antagonize the white South and occasion the loss of the solid South. Interestingly, most of the major civil rights groups honor that hiatus. There are no major civil rights campaigns in '64 mounted by the Congress of Racial Equality or Martin Luther King Southern Christian Leadership Conference. One civil rights organization, however, does not go along with the hiatus, and that is Snick, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the most daring, the most radical, the most creative of the civil rights organizations. Indeed, not only did they not honor the call for a hiatus, they in fact want to use the publicity attendant to that year's presidential race as the central linchpin and logic of the Summer Project. That Summer Project, the centerpiece of the Freedom Summer Project was going to be voter registration. It became obvious very early on in the summer that the Southern registrars were not going to register black voters. They were turning them away as they always had. And in what I think is a brilliant strategic move, the Snick Brain Trust said, all right, you're not going to let us participate in the regular political process this year. We'll create our own parallel process. And with that in mind, they create an organization, the second Mississippi Democratic Party structure or organization in Mississippi, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They spend the summer freedom registering thousands of Mississippians, mostly black. And starting in July, they do what is going on in every other state with party organizations, Republican and Democrat, in the country in a presidential year. They meet at the precinct level, the county level, and finally in a state convention in Jackson, Mississippi to select a delegation to send to Atlantic City to the National Democratic Convention to challenge the seating of the Lily White official Mississippi delegation. The opening act of all conventions is a credentials committee hearing. This is normally just absolutely routine. Each state delegation appears in turn. They present their credentials. The committee says everything appears to be in order, and the delegates are given their passes to take their seats on the floor. It wasn't routine in Atlantic City because 2 delegations showed up to claim the Mississippi spots. This was high drama, especially given the deaths that had occurred in Mississippi that Charlie alluded to. This was front page news that entire summer, and here's a challenge delegation appearing before the Credentials Committee. The spokesperson for the delegation was a remarkable woman named Fannie Lou Hamer, and essentially Fannie Lou Hamer simply got up and told her story. It's a riveting story. This is my memory from that summer. I was an 11-year-old kid, something of a political junkie already, and I watched her testimony until it was cut off. That's a part of the story, and was powerfully moved by it. I'll come back to that in a minute. In any case, here's Fannie Lou Hamer's story. I won't do it justice, but Fannie Lou Hamer in 1962 was around 40 years old, was a native Mississippian, had lived on a plantation all of her life. And she agreed to go down to the courthouse in Ruleville, Mississippi with a group that Snick had organized to go and try to register to vote. As almost always happened, the group was turned away. But what happened next was unusual. As they left Ruleville and they were being transported in a beat-up old former school bus, the Mississippi police pulled them over, arrested everybody. One of the charges was impersonating a school bus. It's on the arrest record. They took them and held them overnight in jail and beat them savagely. Fannie Lou Hamer in particular. They were beaten by black trustees, meaning long-term black prisoners who were under the control of the white law enforcement. They had nothing really to hold them on. This was just to scare them. The next morning they released them. Fannie Lou Hamer, badly injured, tries to go back to her plantation where she lives with her husband. The overseer on the plantation says, "You're a troublemaker, you don't have a home here anymore." I don't remember all the specifics, how long it takes her to sort of recover from her injuries, but in an act of extraordinary courage, she shows up at the Snick office in Ruleville, knocks on the door and says, "I don't have a home anymore, the movement's my home, I want to organize." And she becomes the moral voice of the Mississippi movement. She tells this story to the Credentials Committee, and when she gets to the end, she pounds her fist down and she says, "If you don't seat us, I question America." And there are hardened party regulars crying in the room. I'm at home crying. I don't know what exactly is going on, but I'm moved by this. This is powerful stuff. At that moment, it looked for all the world as if the committee would seat the challenge delegation. It seemed like they had the weight of moral authority on their side. And in point of fact, the Mississippi delegation, the regular delegation, was so offended by what was going on, they had taken off and gone home to Mississippi anyway. Johnson, monitoring this in the White House, was appalled. Not because he didn't support civil rights, but because this is exactly the kind of offense to the the southern wing of his party that he was hoping to avoid. He actually gets the live coverage of her testimony pulled, and at that point, he is determined to make sure that the challenge delegation is not seated, and he engages in exactly the kind of backroom politics that Johnson knew how to do. And in the end, the committee does not seat the challenge delegation. They're offered a compromise of 2 at-large seats on the floor of the convention and then passes to sit up in the balcony, which sounds a lot like the back of the bus. Most moderate civil rights leaders, including Dr. King, urges the delegation to accept the compromise and said, "This is a great victory." The delegation goes into secret session, and Fannie Lou Hamer comes out and says, I want to tell you what you can do with your 2 seats. That's not quite the end of it. Sympathetic delegates from other state delegations give their passes to the challenge delegation, and the challenge delegation stages a sit-in in the Mississippi section, and are arrested and carried out singing "We Shall Overcome." That's powerful stuff. But that's also a big part of why the South votes Republican in 1964. I'm not saying that Freedom Summer is the whole of the cause. There's lots of other things pushing the white South in this direction, but that was an important part of the story without doubt. As this is going on, what is the GOP doing? So as the Democrats are moving sharply left in the 60s, first around the issue of race and then on other issues, the GOP, formerly the more liberal on race, is moving aggressively to the right to court white racial conservatives, not just in Mississippi, not just in the South, but nationwide. Much has been made of Nixon's Southern strategy and his victory in 1968, but the GOP's racially inflected shift to the right happens much earlier and is not simply focused on the South. This is racial liberalism based on the voting records, the civil rights voting records of Democrats and Republicans in Congress in the 85th and 89th Congress, and you see the years of those Congresses. You can see this dramatic shift that precedes Nixon's election in 68. So again, in the 85th Congress, the great majority of civil rights liberals are Republicans. By the time you get to the 89th, things have shifted. So the shift to the right on matters of race starts much earlier than Nixon's election in 68. And as I said, it's not simply focused on wooing white Southern conservatives. I want to mention the significance of this man, George Wallace. I actually had an audio clip, but it's not working. George Wallace is elected as the governor of Alabama in 1963 and vows in his inaugural address, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and to a tumultuous reception, not surprisingly. He also vows in his inaugural address that he will stand in the schoolhouse door to block desegregation, school desegregation in Mississippi. He makes good on that for one day at least, early in 1964, as he bars the admission of the first 2 black students admitted to the University of Alabama. Shortly after this, he announces, he stuns the country in a sense. People in the North, many in the North, thought this was a joke. He's an arch segregationist, and he says he's going to challenge this very popular sitting incumbent president of his own party, Lyndon Johnson, for the Democratic presidential nomination in '64. People really thought that was a joke. He then enters 3 primaries. In Wisconsin, he takes 1/3 of the vote. Liberal, Northern, Labor, Wisconsin. The party rallies big time nationally to try to stop him in Indiana. He still takes 31% of the vote, and the last primary he enters is Maryland. He captures 47% of the vote. People aren't laughing so much anymore. So this is not just about the disaffected white Southerners fleeing the Democratic Party. There is a nationwide white backlash, and the Republican Party is moving right to court the votes of white racial conservatives. Still, Nixon's win and the racial policies he pursues during his first term moves the GOP that much further to the right. By the end of the 1960s, both parties have moved sharply off center politically. Republicans to the right, Democrats to the left, and the Republicans are already beginning demographically and geographically to look like today's GOP. That is disproportionately white and Southern. And I'll conclude with these 2 slides. This is the racial composition of the 2 parties now. So 90% of GOP voters are white as compared to 60% of Democratic voters. You can see the other numbers. And then here is the shifting geography of the House. Notice the Republican, that absolutely no Republicans, or almost no Republicans in the South in 1963, and look at the flip. The Democrats were overwhelmingly Democratic. The Democrats were overwhelmingly Southern in '63. Now there's virtually no presence, and it's the reverse for the Republicans. And I will stop on that note. Thank you very much.
One thing I'd like to add to what Doug McAdam has already said about the shift, and it's something that I use often when I'm talking about the changing politics of the United States, is that the 1964 election was the last election in American history to this date in which a majority of white Americans voted for the more liberal or Democratic candidate. It hasn't happened since then, and it's not likely to happen in the lifetime of most of the people here in this audience. That's a reality that I recall when Barack Obama won the presidency in 2008, and it was my task to talk about the significance of the election at a historical meeting. And at that time, there was this kind of optimism about the meaning of Barack Obama's election. But when you think of that reality of the change since 1964, it reinforces that notion that something really fundamental happened in American politics. But I won't say any more about that, because what I really want to talk about is something else that happened in 1964, and it has very much to do with the Freedom Summer. And it also brings in my own experiences into this. And that is, the idea for this kind of comes from a book that I remember reading about the 1960s. And at the very beginning of the book, the author said, for him, the 60s began in 1965. And what he meant by that is that there's this idea of the 60s, a frame of mind that we identify with the 60s. And for him, it was the anti-war movement coming in 1965, the counterculture, all of these kinds of things. But the generalization that I would draw from that is that for many people, the 60s began the moment they began to be aware that something else was going on in American society that didn't fit under all of the standard notions of American politics and American culture. And that is symbolized by events like Mississippi Summer. For me, in 1963, I was a 19-year-old college student. I had never been politically involved. I grew up in New Mexico. I had read about the events that were going on in the South. I had read about these wonderful civil rights workers. You know, for me, growing up as a black person in a town that had 3 black families, these were my role models. These were the people who I admired. And finally, in that summer, I was able to have my first contact with a group of people I called Freedom Riders, because they all kind of took that name from the Freedom Rides of 1961. And practically any activist during that period was given that, that title of being a Freedom Rider. And I was at a convention that summer in Bloomington, Indiana, at the University of Indiana, for the National Student Association. And the big question, this was just days before the March on Washington, the big question was the NSA going to support the March on Washington? Now, the NSA, some of you might know, was known as a liberal organization. Most of its support came outside the South, and yet this was a contentious issue, because even people who supported the March on Washington felt that to take a stand in favor of the march would mean that NSA would lose its chance to expand on Southern campuses. So there was a big fight over this. And the black delegates who were there mobilized a caucus. And the leader of this caucus was a student from Howard University by the name of Stokely Carmichael. For me, that was my first contact with a person who had actually been a Freedom Rider, who had actually been in the South. And Stokely Carmichael, I recall, represented a different attitude, not just about civil rights, but about American liberalism, about the Democratic Party, about conventional politics. All of this was kind of wrapped up in his experiences, even then, in what was going on in the South and what was going on in particular with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. there was something about him that struck me as here is a person with a different view of American society. I recall when I said that I wanted to go to the March on Washington, and this was going to be the most radical thing I'd ever done in my life, that he dismissed that. Just said, you know, look, if you really want to do something, why go to that picnic in Washington? Why don't you go to Albany, Georgia? Why don't you go to Cambridge, Maryland? Why don't you go all these other places I'd never heard of? And in fact, all these places that I had no intention, once I did hear about them and what was going on, I was not about to go to them. I was going to go safely back to school. Well, I went back to school. I was at the University of New Mexico then. But by then, I was very curious. In fact, I had a subscription to the Student Voice, and all the people that I had met at this convention had really impressed me. They were people doing things that I wanted to do. They were doing exciting stuff. And I was invited to a meeting in New Orleans. And at the meeting, the main discussion was the summer project. This was in December of 1963. And I recall meeting another person who had this kind of impact on me, and that was Bob Moses, who was there. And the thing that struck me and what kind of reinforced what John Stokely Carmichael had said is that Bob Moses represented a part of the movement that was not publicized in the newspapers, that most people knew very little about. In fact, I knew very little about. I had heard of Martin Luther King. I had heard about the Montgomery bus boycott. And of course, I'd been to the March on Washington. But what Bob Moses and Aaron Henry, Amzie Moore was there, what all of these people represented was a movement in the rural Deep South that was not only pro-civil rights, but it was trying to achieve something that even the Martin Luther Kings of the world were not trying to achieve at that point. That they represented a movement that was not reliant on the major civil rights organizations. And Snick, only in the imagination of Snick, was a major civil rights organization. Its workers were paid $10 a week. And they were doing work in parts of the country that was not getting any publicity. And in fact, that had a lot to do with why they were organizing the summer project. They understood that in order to draw the attention of the country, they would have to do something quite radical, and that is bring hundreds of students. And in fact, they thought that they might get 500, and of course it ended up even more than that. But they were going to bring these students to Mississippi, and that's what the plan that was presented by Bob Moses at this New Orleans gathering. And again, I had a choice. You know, just like Stokely Carmichael gave me a choice, go to Albany, go to March on Washington. I went to the March on Washington. This was the choice. Do you want to go to Mississippi and spend the summer of 1964 there? Well, actually, I was, by that time, very tempted. And it's significant in my own memory that one of the decisive factors in not going was that they wanted people who had the financial wherewithal to be able to bail themselves out, to be able to bring their own resources to Mississippi. I worked during the summer in order to go back to school in the fall. And so this became a very difficult decision in my life. When I think back of how things might have been different by going, I think it might have been different in a number of different ways. One of them, of course, the impact on me of having gone to and participated in the Mississippi Summer Project. But I think also it would have been a different kind of Mississippi Summer Project if there had been black students like me in significant numbers in Mississippi that summer. But in any case, it didn't happen that way. But again, what I got from both Stokely Carmichael and Bob Moses was this notion of a movement from the bottom up rather than the top down. if any one idea has shaped everything that I've done in my life, including my teaching, my writing, everything that I've written, it's that one insight that when you look at society from the bottom up rather than the top down, it looks differently. And if you look at American society from the point of view of Fannie Lou Hamer, other people in rural Mississippi, it looks quite different, even than through the viewpoint of a Martin Luther King who came out of urban Atlanta. What are these differences? Well, I mean, one of the things that I think captured this was John Lewis's speech at the March on Washington. He was the youngest speaker at the march. He was the person representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. For me, his speech was the highlight of the march, even though now I'm editing Martin Luther King's papers. But for me, what he represented and in that speech is captured in that phrase, one man, one vote. It's the African cry. It should be our cry also. That basic democratic notion that those who were at the bottom of the American social order should be able to participate in determining the destiny of this country. That was a radical idea then. I think it's a radical idea today. I think we are still, in some ways, coming to terms with that truly radical notion that came out of the Delta of Mississippi in 1964. One of the ways in which I think we've seen that disseminated throughout the country were the students who went south in 1964, and what did they do later on? Now, Doug McAdam is one of the, probably the expert on studying the students who went south in 1964 and what happened later in their lives. But one of the things that is quite clear is that they were shaped by that experience in a variety of ways. Not all of them, but certainly a large number of them would never again look at American society the same. So I think that one of the things that we can do, and I'm looking forward to Marshall Gantz's and Mary King, because of course they were even more deeply involved. But for me, coming even as I've studied that movement and interviewed the people involved, that notion of a movement from the bottom up, in my view, is a notion that allows us to understand what is going on in the world today, not simply in the United States. In recent years, I've begun to see that there is the greatest freedom struggle that humanity's ever seen that's taking place throughout the world. One of the ways in which you can capture that is the notion of peasants becoming citizens. 200 years ago, 300 years ago, the vast majority of people on Earth were peasants. Some of them still are. How did peasants become citizens? How did they liberate themselves from being the subordinate people without rights, without land, without wealth, without literacy? You know, all of these things that we associate with poverty and peasantry throughout the world, that was the condition that many people found in the Delta of Mississippi in 1964. One of the ways in which I think the radical implications of this was captured is a poster that was developed by by John Lewis's voter education project. And it is, the hands that once picked cotton can now pick presidents. And to the extent that that is true, that to me captures what we need to understand about the importance of Mississippi summer. I think it came home to me as I wrote my memoir that Charlie mentioned, Martin's Dream. as I thought about my own family, and I'll just end on this. In 1940, my mother was a peasant, living in rural Florida. She had actually finished high school, a very small high school with about 20 to 30 students, in which she said that she was the #1 graduate, so the valedictorian. And I looked, just in terms of research for the book, I looked her up in the 1940 census. She was listed as a maid for a white family, 1940. She already had a child. She was unmarried, but and my half-sister, she had never voted in her life. And of course, she had never owned any property. When I think that 10 years later, she is living in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in a 3-bedroom house, married to an Army officer who went south to train in Alabama because of World War II, and she met there, and that's why I'm here. That these changes, these dramatic changes of peasants becoming citizens is still going on as we speak, right here in Palo Alto, right here in all parts of this country. And I think that when we begin to understand history as this phenomenon, that we need to see it from the bottom up rather than the top down, from the point of view of the least privileged rather than the more privileged groups in society, I think we get the great insight that is given to us by Mississippi Summer.
Good evening. Anybody out there? Good evening. Thank you. Let's just all be here. Thanks to Charlie and Suzanne for organizing this, to Doug and Clay and Mary, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. It's an opportunity to recall, reflect, and hopefully renew as well. The last time I saw Mary actually was when at the 1976 Democratic Convention in New York, when I was a Jerry Brown delegate, and Mary was a much more successful Carter delegate at that convention, as I recall. So it's great to have this opportunity. I want to say a few words about why I went to Mississippi, what I learned there, and what I took from it. I grew up in Bakersfield. Here I don't have to say Bakersfield, California. Back east I have to say where my father was a rabbi, my mother was a teacher. But we had lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War when he was a chaplain in the American Army. And his work was mostly with Holocaust survivors. And as a child, I met people whose lives had been shattered by that horror, who came through our home. My 5th birthday party was actually in what were called DP camps, displaced persons camps. This was all children. And it was my mother's idea that I should give gifts rather than getting them. Not my idea, I can assure you. And I even thought it was kind of neat that it was all kids until I was given to understand where the parents were, that they were lost. And so the Holocaust was a reality in our home, but my parents interpreted it to me, I'm so grateful, not simply as a consequence of anti-Semitism, but of racism, and that racism kills. Very simple. Not a complex political, ideological question. Racism kills. When you transform people into objects and treat them as objects that are of inferior worth, anything goes. The civil rights movement was challenging that, and challenging the institutionalized racism at the heart of our history. Now, as a rabbi's kid, no, Mary's a PK. Actually, I'm an RK. So I don't know if you're going to talk about that or not, but you know what PKs are? Preacher's kids. Yeah, right. Preacher's kids, right. Yeah, it's sort of, at least from my experience, it's sort of a mixed deal. You have to go to all the things, all the sort of stuff, which can be interesting. You're also supposed to be perfect, that's where the issues lie. But I loved the Passover Seders, and it's that time of year right now. And I loved that story of the journey from slavery to freedom with food, which was nice. But there's a part in the Seder where they turn to the children and they say, you were slaves in Egypt. And so wait a second, I've never been to Egypt, I've never been a slave. And again, it was one of those things that with time I came to understand what it meant, that story wasn't the story of one time, place, or even one people. It was a story told generation after generation, and you had to sort of figure out where you were in that narrative. Were you with Pharaoh and those guys in the chariots, or were you with these people who were trying to find a land of promise? Well, civil rights movement told the same story, literally the same story. Thirdly, it was a movement of young people. Now, when I finished Bakersfield High School in 1960, one of my objectives was to get as far from Bakersfield as I possibly could. All due respect to Bakersfield, if anyone present. And I was fortunate to get a scholarship to Harvard, which was just about as far from Bakersfield as you could possibly get in so many different ways. So I was there for 2 years and sort of trying to find my way. Took a third year off and lived in Berkeley that year, 1962, 63. I wound up at a Pete Seeger concert at the Longshoremen's Hall in the spring of '64. He was singing this medley of freedom songs. And the whole point, you know, he would do sermons in song. And one of the point was this was young people. Ain't afraid of my dog, ain't afraid of your dog, says I want my freedom, I want my freedom. This was about young people. And later that year, as I went back for my junior year at Harvard, President Kennedy was assassinated. And it seemed like everything was up in the air and up for grabs. And then I met people. Dottie Zellner, who had been a Snick field secretary, she organized the Friends of Snick at Harvard in the Epworth Methodist Church basement. And I began to meet the Snick people coming through. And, you know, they were doing it. They were walking the walk. I mean, you know, it was so, how to justify then became a problem. And then in the spring, Snick discovered that Harvard owned stock in Mississippi Power and Light Company. So a number of us drove down to Atlanta on spring break and to the first Snick staff meeting I went to at Gammon Theological Seminary in Atlanta. And I thought, I'm going to go in and meet all these revolutionaries. And it turns out they were having a preach-off in there. You know what a preach-off is? Who could imitate Dr. King better? There was this spirit of struggle and joy that was so compelling. When the summer project came up, it was something that I wanted to be part of. Later I read a book, Walter Brueggemann, a Protestant theologian, wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination. And in it he says that transformational vision occurs at the intersection, he says, of two things: of criticality, which is a clear view of the world's hurt, of its pain, of its need, coupled with hope, a sense of its possibilities and its promise. And young people come of age with a critical eye on the world they find, and almost of necessity hopeful hearts. And that was so in our generation, but it was so in the civil rights movement, and it was so in the people I met from Snick, that how could you not, in a way, want to be part of it? So I volunteered for the Mississippi Summer Project, and I remember it was explained, you know, Bob Moses had a theory. He said, you know, that the law in the U.S. covers some people and not other people, and it covers northern white people and not southern black people. And so if we want to bring the law to Mississippi, you have to bring the people the law covers to Mississippi. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So, in Mississippi, I learned some things about the world, about people, and about myself. About the world, I learned that inequality, challenging inequality was housing, healthcare, you name it, all the different inequalities of whites and blacks that were part of daily life in the South, well, throughout the country, but so evident in Mississippi. But it wasn't enough to ask what, but it was necessary to ask why. In other words, that works of charity, of caring for the consequences of inequality, were simply not enough when you had to ask why all that inequality, which meant you had to engage with it underneath and understand why, which meant that you were going to go beyond charity to the work of justice, which meant conflict, and it meant struggle, and it meant dealing with power, the question of power. It meant understanding the fact that African Americans had no political mechanisms of accountability, economically marginalized, and I'd simply never had the experience of going up to somebody twice my age who would stand up, offer me his chair, call me mister, introduce himself with his first name and not look me in the eye because he was black and I was white, and that went on thousands of times a day across the South. And putting together the economic and political and cultural powerlessness meant that you weren't going to change anything unless you dealt with the question of power. And that was a gift in terms of, with all due respect to Harvard, Mississippi is really where my education about race, power, and politics began. Second, I learned that organizing could be a pathway to justice, that there were ways in which ordinary people could combine their resources, if done strategically and with great solidarity, that could actually begin to turn things around. Whether it was a question of walking to work instead of riding the bus, as in Montgomery, Alabama, or a question of sitting someplace you didn't belong, or a question of thinking that you had the right to go to the Democratic convention and you were entitled to a seat as well. That there were ways ordinary people could combine their resources so as to generate the power that they needed to begin to create change. That there was this thing called developing leadership, building community around leadership, building resources from building power from the resources of community, and that in fact justice could rarely be achieved in any other way, because justice can't be given; it has to be earned. Just as power can't be given; it has to be earned. And this is what we were learning, but not in some theoretical context, but in the day-to-day realities of what the work was in Mississippi. I learned, third, that the world is not fair, but it is tractable. We used to have, there was a sign that said, there is a town in Mississippi called Liberty, there is a department in Washington called Justice. I remember that very, very well. But it was an exercise not in probability, but possibility. Maimonides, the 12th century scholar, defined hope, he said, as belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. In other words, that to be a realist is to recognize that we live in a world that is governed not entirely by probability, but also possibility, that it is always probable Goliath will win, but sometimes David does. And that sense of possibility is precious. And that sense of possibility is really where hope lies. And that sense of possibility was what we lived that summer, despite the costs, the hurt, the pain, despite going to the Democratic convention, being betrayed by everybody who we thought were our friends. But we were there, we were engaged, it was changing. And we were part of changing it. And that experience of agency, of consequence, and of actually, when I was supposed to go back to Harvard and didn't, I wrote him a letter. I said, how can I go back and study history when we're busy making it? Which was a little bit of undergraduate arrogance, but it also happened to be true. All right. Now, I learned some things about people, and I learned that these causes, these issues, their meaning is revealed in the people who they are, who they're about. Whether it was Hollis Watkins, who's chairing the reunion down in Mississippi this year. Hollis was 2 years older than me. He was my mentor. I was so blessed to have someone like that who taught me to listen, to ask, to not give advice, to ask, to pay attention. E.W. Steptoe, somebody in his 50s, who was one of the pioneer leaders that I lived with for 6 months out in Amite County, Mississippi, who I got to ride with for 6 months and learn the wisdom of the world. Those realities. How do you sustain courage under those circumstances? So the people that you work with, the people who were this movement and are this movement, matter, and that they amaze you, and that they'll disappoint you, and that they're bundles of courage and of fear, and of wisdom, and of foolishness, and of cruelty, and of grace, but that is the substance of this work. I can't forget the night before, federal registrars, and this was after Summer Project, federal registrars, after the Voting Rights Act, took over the courthouse in Liberty, Mississippi, to register the first African-American voters. I think there were 2 registered since Reconstruction. And there was a meeting to decide who was going to be the first person to go. One person was a young man named Herbert Lee Jr. His father had been killed 3 years before, shot down by the state senator on the streets of Liberty, Mississippi, when Snick made its first efforts in Amite County, Herbert Lee. He wanted to go be first. And then there was Ben Faust, and Ben Faust claimed to be 104, born a slave, hunched over from picking cotton, and the discussion was who would be first. The group decided Ben should be first. And I have to tell you, standing at that courthouse and watching Ben Faust go register to vote, that was real. That was real. That's not theory, that's reality changing and shifting. So I also learned that the work of the heart matters as much as the work of the head, and that valuing the sources of why we care is the foundation of figuring out how we can act on what we care about. What I learned about myself. I learned about fear, learned about my own and others. I learned that you could get through it. I learned that I really cared about working with people I admired. And having the opportunity to work with values that I cared about, but I also cared about making a difference, that it mattered, that it would have consequence. I learned about the energy that comes of the intersection of inside and outside. You know, Jewish white student from the north working in Mississippi with the African American community down there, inside, outside, full of tension, full of all sorts of struggle, but also enormously creative. Also a source of enormous tension that can turn into energy. That was an important learning for me. And later I was the Anglo working with Mexican farm workers, the Jew working with Arabs, the old guy working with young people when I teach right now. There's something about boundary crossing that is enormously generative and something to be embraced, not run away from. And I learned I could do the work. I learned there was this thing called organizing and I could do it. So what did I take from Mississippi? Well, first were relationships. I talk about people. You know, my roommate in Macomb was a young man named Mario Savio who came back here to set up a table over in front of, at Sather Gate up at Berkeley to raise money for CORE. And you know, Mario had this terrible stutter. You know, he could barely speak. He had this terrible stutter when he was in Mississippi. And he set up that table. And as it began a movement, the free speech movement literally freed his speech and freed the speech of a generation of challenge. The relationships, it's like Mississippi was a magnet that created then a crucible in which people connected with each other and then went out, changed but connected in ways they hadn't been connected before. I found a calling. I loved this work. But I also learned that it would take craft to learn to do it well. And so when I came back to Bakersfield, really thinking I was going to go back to school, but discovered that Cesar Chavez had started a grape strike just 30 miles from Bakersfield the month before, it turned out that I found a way to continue the work. And that finding a way to continue that work was related to this third what I took from Mississippi, and that was, you know, I grew up in Bakersfield. I grew up in the middle of the farm worker world, but I had never seen it. You know, I had to go to Mississippi and get what I call Mississippi eyes to come back and see, oh, here was another community of people of color, also without political rights, also with no economic protections that other workers had had since the 1930s. And guess what? California had its own rich history of racial segregation going back to the turn of the century, beginning with the Chinese, and as late as the 50s were desegregating movie theaters in LA that had Mexicans upstairs and whites downstairs. So it turned out that Mississippi was not an exception to America, but it was an example of the America we needed to change. And that's the work that called me for the next 28 years. Thank you.
This is so exciting to be here with my fellow panelists and with all of you. I would like to say at the beginning that my experience working for Snick was the closest that I will ever be to real democracy. We made all of our big decisions by consensus. This was not neat, but it was a very profound experience. And virtually everything else I've done for the rest of my life has been based on what I learned working for Snick and in the Mississippi Freedom Summer. So my family roots are in North Carolina and Virginia going back into the 1600s, the late 17th century. So how did I get to Snick for 4 years? In my senior year at Ohio Wesleyan University, I was part of a group from the campus YWCA. That was the place on that campus to go if you had any interest in international affairs or domestic issues. And the campus YWCA always made a trip. The year before I was a senior, it went to Russia. In my year, it went to Nashville, Atlanta, and Tuskegee. So I was part of 2 station wagon loads of students who crawled out of Delaware, Ohio, made the way to Nashville, and there I met some of the people that everyone on this panel has talked about. John Lewis, Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette in Nashville. In Atlanta, I met Julian Bond, Jim Foreman, Casey Hayden, now Sandra Kaysen, and Miss Ella Baker. Miss Ella Baker and Professor Howard Zinn contacted me as I was waiting for the bus after I was graduated from Ohio Wesleyan and said, would you fly to North Carolina to be interviewed? I called home and I said, well, I'm not coming home yet. I'm flying to North Carolina because I have these people who want to talk to me. They invited me to join a national YWCA human rights, human relations project based in Atlanta, where I would travel along with a black counterpart, Bobby Yancey, recently graduated from Barnard College, and we would go as a pair traveling to southern campuses. Miss Baker was the advisor to that project. It turned out to be impossible to do. Really, it was only at Chapel Hill that Bobby and I were able to travel together and speak together. Everywhere else we had to work separately. But we organized workshops that were led by Miss Baker and Howard Zinn, where students that we would find who were interested in questioning segregation would attend. And so I had the most extraordinary experience of working alongside one of the great figures of social history in the United States in the 20th century for a year in Miss Baker, who also happened to be one of the key advisors to Snick. And she was a remarkable person. The depth of her concern about the development of leadership had been honed in the 1930s and 1940s. And she worked for so many different organizations, from the Works Progress Administration. But what I most enjoyed hearing her talk about was traveling alone as a black woman in Mississippi in the 1940s to organize NAACP chapters. One of the things she used to talk with me about is how imperative it is that the oppressed define their own freedom. Now, the YWCA had a long-term policy on the eradication of racism. This turned out to be very important for me. The idea of combining, aiming something for very, very big, like eradication of racism, with, on the other hand, the development of leadership for girls and women. Combined, this is where I started in the movement, and I'm still there, all these decades later. I started volunteering for Snick on the weekends, and at the end of the year project, Snick Executive Secretary Jim Foreman invited me onto staff and sent me to Danville, Virginia to handle communications. I said, but Jim, I don't know how to write a press release. He said, oh, don't worry, you'll learn, which was the basic attitude in Snick. Don't worry, you'll learn. Working in the civil rights movement gave knowledge, training, experience, and proficiencies to the women who participated in it. There was no women's wing, no women's auxiliary. Often, organizing in the movement for the local people and for those of us on staff who were female was the first nurturing of leadership skills. Snick in particular was profoundly committed to female participation in the struggle, in large part due to Ella Baker's influence and her influence on Bob Moses. Let me give you an idea precisely of what this meant. In November 1963, we decided to hold a mock ballot in Mississippi because we wanted to demonstrate to the country that black citizens in Mississippi wanted to vote. The white oligarchs said black citizens didn't want to vote. They were happy with the way everything was. So we organized a mock ballot. And in the 2nd Congressional District, there were 5 districts, the 2nd Congressional District, we put up Fannie Lou Hamer on the mock ballot. Annie Devine in the 3rd Congressional District, and Victoria Jackson Gray in the 5th. So in 3 out of 5 congressional districts in Mississippi, we put up women. I dare to say that there was probably nowhere else in the United States of America at that time where you would have found anything like that. Of course, it seemed logical to me because I had learned that women were in fact the backbone of the organizing in the movement. Now, the Freedom Summer meant a huge opening for its participants in learning and knowledge. It let us grow exponentially because we went from being a very small staff. We were able to expand enormously because of the 1,000 volunteers who joined us. And midway through the Freedom Summer, the efforts on voter registration shifted to freedom registration to become ready for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge that Doug mentioned. In August, as he so well recalled, the country was electrified by watching Fannie Lou Hamer on television with her fierce authenticity, even though President Lyndon Johnson tried to divert attention away. But the impact of only being offered 2 at-large seats after the enormity of the process of documentation that had gone on in the state was profound on the staff. Accompanied by staff or volunteers, local black people went to attend every precinct and ward meeting of the regular all-white Democratic Party at the local level. And as they were turned away, all of that was documented so that eventually tomes of documentation went to Atlantic City. with that offer of only 2 seats and what Marshall talked about betrayal, which is what we felt, the dismay and discouragement on the staff and among local people was very deep. At that point, Jim Foreman suggested that everyone on Snick staff ought to write a position paper with their view of the future for Snick. The papers would all be circulated and reviewed, and we would gather at a staff retreat on the coast of Mississippi at Waveland. In November 1964, Casey and I wrote a paper with input from lots of other women. At its heart, our paper was asking if Snick's ideal of leadership did not also mean that the rights of women should be among the concerns of the larger movement. But we feared ridicule, and we did not sign the paper. A year later, in November 1965, Casey and I again sat down and wrote a paper, which we called Sex and Caste. I have copies of that here with me tonight if any of you are interested. And we sent it by mail to 40 women who were working in the peace and civil rights movements across the country. This was another call for solidarity resulting from endless hours of talks among women, SNCC workers, local people, volunteers. And what we argued was that the problems of women functioning in society as equal human beings were among the most basic of the problems of humanity. The 40 recipients circulated it. In April 1966, Liberation magazine of the War Resisters League published it, and that gave further distribution. And the women to whom we had sent it and others who received it began meeting in small groups to discuss the paper. And that became what historians like Sarah Evans and Ruth Rosen call consciousness-raising groups. And broadly dispersed, provided a base for what would become the women's liberation movement. So women's liberation was multiracial and often radical, and arose directly from the experiences of women who had worked in the Mississippi Freedom Summer, in the civil rights movement, and in Students for a Democratic Society. It was intentionally decentralized, as was the civil rights movement. In August 1970, a national women's strike was enormous, manifesting itself almost everywhere in the United States. But after 1970, this label of women's liberation would be applied to a profusion of groups, many of which did not know about their predecessors, indeed did not realize that women, black and white, who had been working in the civil rights movement had drawn concrete knowledge, skills, tangible lessons, learning how to organize, and that this experience had accelerated them to move on and make claims for justice and rights for women. The term women's liberation would subsequently vanish in the United States, attributable both to its successes and fierce opposition, but not before it had diffused and morphed into work on a host of diverse issues. It helped to catalyze Chicana, Asian, and new black organizing efforts. But is that what I meant when I said diverse? Not exactly. A few years ago, I met with a group of mountain women in eastern Kentucky, and I asked them, what is the #1 women's issue in Appalachia? Driver's education, they responded. They said if they couldn't get out of the hollows to escape drunken and abusive husbands who would beat them and their children, they were in very, very deep trouble, and therefore driver's ed was number one. Hear Miss Baker's voice. The oppressed must define their own freedom. Now, many splits and divisions would weaken the women's liberation movement, yet broader forces were at work that would eventually compel feminism and gender studies from its generative energy, two of the major developments of the 20th century. Internationally, women's mobilizing sparked other movements and made its way into the final bastion, as I regard it, the United Nations, so that in 2000, the Security Council passed Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, recognizing the indissoluble importance of the involvement of women in any and all peace building. So the Freedom Summer represented a moment that was transformative in the sense of representing a climactic turning point that increased the breadth of mobilization and span of focus. It would have the effect of opening political space, as social movements tend to do, not only for women, but for other constituencies, such as those working against the war in Vietnam and the embryonic environmental preservation movement. So in closing, let me say that for the women and men who experience the Freedom Summer, either as volunteers or staff, this was a time in which young volunteers would join with local people and together learn how to exert social power. And they would wield that power to confront the nation's tolerance of the institutionalized racism in the South, the corruption of police services, the collusion between law officers and terror and vigilante groups, and acceptance of politics, often drenched in hatred. And for many, if not most of us, the totality of this experience would set a standard for the rest of our lives. Thank you.
Well, our program was supposed, we went a little longer than we were supposed to. And the second part of the evening was supposed to be a moderated sort of panel discussion. And I had a few questions to ask the panelists. I am going to drop that part of the program because you guys have been sitting patiently waiting. And for all of us, I think the richest part of evenings like this is frankly the Q&A. So I'm just going to simply open it up. Or Charlie, do you want to moderate? So the mics are open, or the mics are available. Please don't be shy.
I'm moderating this so that you feel free to direct questions to Doug as well as the other three. Ross.
My question, I'm just impressed with the depth of the truth that you speak, and I keep thinking about how in the last year our Supreme Court found that Shelby County no longer needs to have the the Voting Rights Act apply, and I just, if you can explain that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, let me just say, let me say one thing about that. I mean, as I talked about this, I mean, I stopped my account of how we've come to the mess we're in at the end of the 60s. The process continued. I won't get into it, but you saw the numbers. The Republican Party is a overwhelmingly white party, and they understand they've painted themselves into a certain kind of demographic corner. And that's why the transparent efforts over the last 4 to 6 years to restrict voting rights for minorities and poor and immigrants. This is by design. They understand that their demographic base is shrinking, and they need to engage in various kinds of voter suppression efforts to maximize the power of the white vote. And the Supreme Court is helping them do that. the fact that the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act no longer applies is a travesty given those transparent efforts to restrict the vote. Former President Carter last week said something to the effect, I think, Mary, did you tell me this today? Someone did today. Yeah. That the United States at this point, in his view, is a democracy in name only. There are very worrisome things going on at present, and they echo issues that were in play 50 years ago. So the idea that somehow we should look back just simply celebrating the summer project, we need to be, I think, increasingly vigilant to try to bring the full promise of democracy to this country. I love the fact that you highlighted this issue. It's a big issue. Others want to comment on that?
Maybe hear some more questions and then we can get into it.
Yeah, I wonder if you could comment on Stanford's role at that time. I was an undergraduate at that time, at about the same position you were as a junior, and the people that I saw as my models here on campus were people who were engaged in this issue, and I remember being in Memorial Auditorium when there was a gathering, and we had a live feed from the field, and the people who actually took the step of going were always my heroes after that time. But I wonder if you could comment on Stanford's role.
I can say something from the study that I did of the Freedom Summer Volunteers. Stanford sent the second largest contingent to Mississippi. There's two things worth pointing out here. One is, by design, and Clay commented on this, and I'd love to try to pull Clay into this. Snick reached out to the sons and daughters of white privilege. Part of this was a financial necessity. Snick had no money, so they needed people who could could pay their own way. But the other part of this is that Snick had been working virtually without any attendant publicity in the toughest state in the Deep South, Mississippi. And they reasoned that they had reached a stalemate at this point. And the only way to leverage change in Mississippi was to essentially broaden awareness of what was going on and hope the federal government would intervene. And to do that, they needed to bring the sons and daughters of white privilege to Mississippi, knowing the media would follow. So the 5 schools that sent the largest contingents are Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Berkeley, and Princeton. Stanford wouldn't normally fit into that list. The reason Stanford sent so many is because Al Lowenstein was the dean of men on campus. He was involved to a certain extent with the mock vote campaign in the fall of '63 that Mary talked about. And he said, well, why don't you do this on a bigger scale? Or there was conversation about doing it on a bigger scale the following summer. And some of the folks said, well, how are we going to get all those students? And he said, don't worry. In characteristic Al Lowenstein fashion. And so he really worked to recruit students from campus, from Stanford. So that's why the group was as large as it was, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd like to add something, if I could please, Doug. Once again, Jim Foreman dispatched me to Jackson to handle communications after sending me to Danville earlier. And we were joined by 2 professionals from Stanford in the communication shop in Jackson of the Council of Federated Organizations. Francis Mitchell from Los Angeles came, but we were joined by Stephen Breyers, I believe his name was, and Irene Strelitz. And these were pros, and what they did was to double Francis and my numbers. So exponentially, thanks to Stanford, we had 4 people working on communications, of whom I was the least professional. I was just sort of catching on as I went.
I think it's also important to point out that there was a crisis that was provoked by the Mississippi Summer Project within Snick. Part of Snick's ethos was that it was bottom up. It was meant to be grassroots people in Mississippi coming together to liberate themselves. And Bob Moses made that crucial decision that that just wasn't going to happen without outside intervention. But the entry of all the volunteers at the end of the summer, then the question became, can they stay? Because many of them wanted, this had changed their lives. They wanted to join Snick and stay in Mississippi or work with Snick elsewhere. Well, that immediately would have changed the racial composition of Snick, and it would have changed the internal dynamics of decision-making and everything else. And that crisis, which came to a head at the Waveland meeting that Mary talked about, set the stage for the emergence of the Black Power movement later, the decision of many of the black civil rights workers in Mississippi to eventually leave the state, go to Alabama, and begin working in Lowndes County and other places there, and in Lowndes County forming what became known as the Black Panther Party, which was an independent, all-black political party. So there were, I think that the story of Freedom Summer is partly this wonderful story of people coming in and helping to liberate black people in the state, but we also have to keep in mind that there was an underside to that story that was not as positive, and that led to a lot of, I think, the divisions within the left in this country and within the progressive movements in this country.
I agree with that. I want to ask Clay specifically, because you mentioned this in your remarks. What if Snick had been in a position financially to recruit more black students?
Actually, that was one of the things that was discussed at the New Orleans meeting. They talked about having scholarships to try to increase the number of black students who came into the state. But again, that would have undermined the other purpose of it, which was to gain national attention. And there was that cynicism about that, that only the presence of white people in Mississippi would draw the sympathy and support of the nation. And I think that part of the honest telling of that story has to get right at that, because there was Bob Moses, I interviewed him. We interviewed him for about 2 days about his role. We just talked the whole time, and he kind of went over. And of all the decisions that he made during the time there, the decision to bring in the volunteers was the most fateful, the one that caused him the most anguish, not just then, but years later. Was that the right decision? I think he felt that it was the only decision they could make at that time. But it's also the case that many of the black workers on his staff actively opposed that decision. Mm-hmm. And he had to use his enormous authority as Bob Moses, as totally courageous person who came in to win over their support. But I think I don't know whether, Marshall, when you went, did you go through the training or not?
In Oxford?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I've heard from a number of people who went through the training that they could sense some of that ambivalence and sometimes even hostility on the part of some of the staff.
Yeah, I mean, of course there was tension. I mean, yeah, of course there was tension. It's interesting because it varied a lot depending on, how can I say, the leadership. I was fortunate to be working with Curtis Hayes, mm-hmm. Hollis, really stepped up. There were other projects where there were real leadership vacuums, and it was awful. So, I mean, but the tension was very, very, very real. But I remember, too, in Oxford, the night that we got word that Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner had disappeared, because it was the day before a bunch of us were supposed to go, and Bob called a meeting that night, and sort of like in a room like this. where he was sort of sharing what happened. We didn't know exactly, but everybody kind of knew. And saying, I wish I could just tell you to go home, but I can't. If anybody leaves, that's fine, no shame, but I have to ask you to go. It was one of those moments that you never forget. But yeah, he was clearly right there challenging and but I remember the whole room was silent until Gene Wheeler stood up in the back and began singing. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we struggled so long, we must be free. And everybody started singing and then went to Mississippi the next day. So there was a lot of currents and counter-currents, and I think it's important to appreciate them.
I would like to just mention that getting the fundamental decision was not easy. I remember spending days in discussion. I mentioned consensus, making decisions by consensus. That was brought by the Nashville group to the organizing of Snick in Easter 1960, the idea that you would have to achieve a common mind. You can't vote numerically to order people to do something that endangers them. They have to come to it organically of their own. This was not an easy decision. That's one thing I want to add. The other thing is you have to remember that atrocities against black people were not considered newsworthy in the Southern press. And we had only limited number of correspondents who were available for Julian Bond and me to work with and to call when something happened. So part of the idea, I'm just amplifying your point, was that if we had volunteers from all over the country, that would be a way that we could then engage the Associated Press or the United Press International by saying that so-and-so from Princeton has just been arrested in Tupelo. And will you please phone the jail and find out something about them? So that there was a strategic aspect of this that was brilliant, but it contained within it the seeds of something much larger in which Snick was no longer able to guide or provide leadership.
That's true. Linda, Mike?
Witnessing the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in the last few years, all of the successful maneuverings, as you were mentioning, in Republican states to restrict voting rights. This is very consequential. You, Doug, suggested that we should be really thinking about this, you know, what Jimmy Carter said. But besides thinking about it, I wonder if we should have a Freedom Summer right now, or has somebody organized it? Because with all the commemorations of 1964, I've been thinking about this. Has somebody organized people to run to the states where these acts have been done to restrict voting rights and to make a huge effort to get the people registered that are being excluded?
It's a great idea. Why don't you head it up?
Actually, there is a
Good.
There is a very strong movement in North Carolina in particular that's going on at the moment, and it's not getting the national press that it should get, but there have been marches, rallies. I think that's the best way of defeating this, is to make the Republican Party pay a price for that strategy. That if everyone whose vote is being threatened retaliates by making sure that they get registered and making sure that they vote against the party that did this, that maybe that will teach the party a lesson. But I think it's also for the Democratic Party. Part of what has happened, there's been two basic responses to the rise of, that Doug mentioned, of the new Republican Party. One of them that came right out of Mississippi Summer is you respond to it by building a non-white voting base in this country, making that stronger, building up, and you know that strategy all the way through the Jesse Jackson campaigns of the 1980s. One of the strategies behind that was that Ronald Reagan wouldn't have won in 1980 if non-white voters voted to the same extent as middle-class white voters. That he won in a landslide, but they did an analysis of, all these groups voted to the same extent. So that has always been one of the options for the Democratic Party. How do you build that base? But instead, the dominant strategy within the Democratic Party was winning back the Reagan Democrats, the white people who went over to the Republican Party. And those two strategies pull at each other in very different ways in terms of what candidates do to mobilize that vote. And I think we're still, we still have that division within the Democratic Party about which is the way to go. I'm hoping that the Democratic Party understands that the way to go is you build support among the groups that are voting. I mentioned before, I think it's around 43% of the white vote goes Democratic in elections. It's been hovering from about 42% to about 45%, I think, in most elections. It hasn't really budged very much. What has really changed is the amount of voting by non-white voters. And that's what made possible Obama's election in 2008.
So we have a question here, and then Don after this. Here.
Yeah, I think just to observe an observation about that is that, the Republican Party has built itself over the decades on racism. I think the response to that, to draw white voters, and some of it I think can be more openly pointing out the Republican Party's program is really is a war on democracy. But I think more, I don't think the appeal to white working class voters has not been, gee, you really should stop being racist. It should be recognize what the forces are that are making this appeal to you, and that their interests are not yours. Their interests are those of billionaires, and if some of your friends are billionaires, they're doing well, but otherwise they're not. An observation I wanted to make, maybe a spin on what, slightly different on what Doug was saying about who the volunteers were. While I think there was, definitely the feeling we need to bring a lot of white people down here against whom assaults will register as real crimes. I think they were the children of privilege in the sense they came from a lot of elite universities, so I think probably most of them did not. But I think another aspect of it is maybe to recognize there's a sort of a historical, generational aspect of this, which is that in my experience, I'm not necessarily systematic, that a great many of those people, or maybe most of them, were children of progressives and radicals themselves, or red diaper babies. So the volunteers were not really a representative group of America. They're a group that was more responsive to that appeal for social justice. And I don't think we need to be ashamed of that. I think just we need to recognize that kind of the history of movements of social change, breeds more and more people who will, in the next generation, continue to fight for it.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Could I just please add something here in response to your question? There's a group of 40 organizers from across the United States who worked last summer with James Lawson, who Martin Luther King called the mind of the movement, and who taught most of us in Snick everything that we learned at the time about nonviolent civil resistance. They are pinpointing 4 states for action programs. They don't want to be part of a memorialization or commemoration of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. They want to take it as a launching pad for them in their generation to change the country. And the movement that Clay mentioned is called Moral Mondays in North Carolina. And what they have done that is so spectacularly important is to unify across groups that will often be at war with each other, and they've brought them together. So there are some things that you won't read about in the newspapers yet, but as it grows closer to the summer, you'll see more evidence of this. I want all of you who are here tonight to think back to this moment and say, yes, Mary told us there would be things happening. It's important to know that this is not episodic or spontaneous. This is something that a group of young people who worked with Jim Lawson last summer have been working on planning for a year now. There's also the Advancement Project, which has a lot of lawyers from what used to be called the Inc. Fund, the NAACP Legal and Defense Fund, that are gearing up. It's a question of scale. Is that enough? Probably not. We probably need 20 times that.
Thank you. Don?
Yeah, I just would like somebody on the panel to say something about these 38 freedom schools that were mentioned in our handout.
Well, the freedom schools were taught by volunteers. In some cases, they actually built facilities. In other places, they took place under a tree. Well, the basic idea was that young Mississippi black children ought to learn Mississippi history as it was. You can't teach the history of the United States and not give credit to African Americans as having been an enormous, phenomenal power force in the construction of this country. And so the idea was that young black Mississippians would learn history not from a jaundiced, plantation justifying point of view, but from a point of view that recognized the contribution of black people to the building of this country.
Let me add.
Go right ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Many of the teachers in the freedom schools made education their profession for the rest of their lives, so it had an ongoing effect.
The curriculum that was developed diffused widely after that. So it was used in Mississippi to great effect, but that was an educational movement unto itself. And beyond the political impacts of Freedom Summer, there were real educational, there was the diffusion of curricular materials that impacted education, sort of education projects for years after that. I also wanted to come back to your question, partly tying it to the issue of the freedom schools. You're right, there were a fair number of sort of so-called red diaper babies who made their way to Mississippi that summer, but a surprisingly small number. The three largest groups, the largest group, at least according to the data that I collected on the volunteers, were those who came out of a kind of social gospel in action tradition. That was the single largest, it wasn't the majority, but roughly 20%. On their applications, there was an open-ended item that said, why do you want to work in Mississippi this summer? And 20% specifically talked about their religious background. Yeah. We forget just how much activism in the early 60s came through religious institutions and religious motivations. A second group were liberal Democrats who so identified on their applications. Many of them literally were filling the applications out a day or two after President Kennedy was shot. So they were saying, I want to work in Mississippi to honor our late martyred president who called youth to service to America, et cetera. And the third group were teachers, or teachers in training, education majors, who were drawn to the Freedom Summer component of the project. So those three groups also comprised or made up a lot of the volunteers.
Okay, two.
I have two observations and a question for Marshall.
I was in the room with Marshall. You should identify yourself, if you would, please.
I'm sorry?
Would you identify yourself so everybody knows who you are?
My name is Len Edwards.
And Len, you spent the summer
in Mississippi. I was just going to say, I was with Marshall in the room the night that the three civil rights volunteers disappeared. And the night that you talked about with Bob Moses, when the room went silent, and Bob said, you can go home, and that's okay. And I went down to Ruleville the next day, and that's where I spent the summer. And the first observation is, we were scared, and we went anyway. But if you think we were scared, our parents were absolutely terrified. And they became, and this is consistent with what you've said, but you hadn't said it yet. They became local organizers in their communities around the country for their children and for their children's cause. They probably hadn't read about Mississippi until their child went down there. And so in that sense, this was a remarkable success, not just for 1,000 kids and some adults, but for the families of those who watched them go down. Now, is those observations consistent with your?
Well, my mom became chair of something called Bakersfield Friends of Snick. So there you go. Absolutely. It's great.
Len, you're absolutely right. I mean, the ripple effects beyond the 1,000 volunteers were enormous. The family, and remember, these are generally very advantaged families who had had real contacts. And they were mobilized on behalf of their kids and were educated about issues by virtue of the Freedom Summer Project. The ripple effects after the summer, again, if you wanted to generate a nationwide movement, you couldn't do better than bringing students from 200 plus schools to Mississippi. Essentially, this is activist basic training. And then they return to those campuses. And they were, just as the volunteers regarded the Snick staff as these incredible role models, they went back to their campuses and were viewed as role models, kind of activist role models, by at least a small segment of the campuses they returned to. It is no surprise that next academic year, 64-65, there are 8 major student uprisings on northern college campuses. We remember Berkeley, but there's 7 others. And 7 of those 8 were led by returning Freedom Summer volunteers. I think Clay said, you know, we think of the 60s as something that started January 1, 1960. And in fact, in a real sense, the stereotypic activist 60s is more closely dated to the summer of 64 or the fall of 64. Although the sit-ins starting February 1, 1960 play a big role in this as well.
And the freedom rights.
And the freedom rights.
Your questions are so good, we're going to squeeze in 2. So let's, to you please, and then in the middle there. Here in the middle. That first to you.
So I'm interested in the issue of discipline within the movement and with what you're talking about. And so nice to see you, Clay. So when you talk about discipline and the teachings of Lawson, we're trying to bring nonviolence education to the public high school. I teach at Sequoia High School in Redwood City. But I find when you talk about $10 a week working for Snick, $5 a week working for the UFW.
It was a cut in pay. It was like a big...
cut in pay, I know.
Yeah, right.
In terms of motivation of that discipline to keep showing up every day, to keep the work going, what for you personally, whether it's in scholarship or in your own activism, allowed you to keep showing up every day, to keep the work going, whether it was a moral cause or whether it was something even deeper?
Who wants to go for that?
Oh.
You've been great. Thanks a lot.
Clay trained me well.
I think this is a very difficult question to answer because it's different for everyone. I mean, in my family, I was so heavily conscientized to the burden of race on the South. My grandfather had a biography of George Washington Carver, and I used to sit and discuss it with him as a child. And then he taught me about the county in which I now live, that 150,000 men were either died, wounded, or missing in that one little county in the Civil War, which was about slavery. So for me, I was propelled. And for others, I think many of them had their own sources like that gave them strength and fortitude. But then there's also the building of bonds among each other. It's very hard for me to explain to people how much we loved each other and cared about each other, how important we were to each other. There was something very, very strong and special about the bonds among the Snick people. And the volunteers would experience that in their own way as they became rooted in communities. I was with Kathy Sarachild in Boston University the other day, and she talked about Robert Miles as if he were her uncle. So I think the sources came from many fountains. They had to be strong.
But I think, I agree with that, but I think that there is also the explicit commitment to discipline and to rules and to mutual accountability. And I mean, I think many of the most successful projects were clear about that. It's like in the Jewish tradition of Kabbalah, there's sort of two energies. There's one chesed, which is loving kindness. The other is gevura, which is distinction, judgment. And it takes both, I think, to produce what you're asking about. Yeah. And I think in my experience with the farm workers was where we really got that. The work is so valuable and merits such, how can I say it? It's like you don't compose a great symphony without paying attention to each note. We learned that you don't organize as a great organizer if you're not paying attention to every person, every meeting. So there's a kind of commitment to a kind of discipline that expresses the worth and value of what you're doing. And I think that's one side. The other side, of course, is the motivation that puts us there in the first place. But I think it takes both.
I would just say that discipline is one of Jim Lawson's favorite words. It comes out every few minutes.
Excellent answer. Final question, please.
First of all, thank you all for being here. I'm in town visiting from Los Angeles. I'm a professor at the University of Southern California, visiting my girlfriend here, who's the research trustee here at the university. Very proud of her. How would you all, given the nonviolent teachings of Martin Luther King, how did you all reconcile the different messages that were being perpetuated by the Stokely Carmichaels, the Malcolm X's? I mean, how did you deal with that? And my second question is, why aren't people you all's age now as active in the movement? I mean, my students at USC could care less about voting issues or health care issues being denied to those who've been disenfranchised. So those were my two quick questions.
Maybe I could take one crack at that. And one of them is that Stokely Carmichael in 1963, when I met him, was not Stokely Carmichael of the late 60s, who became kind of a Pan-African ideologue. He was an organizer. And part of what made him such a role model then was that he was good at it.
That's right.
And that was, and it was based around this idea of getting support from local people. Part of what made the salary possible is that made it necessary for you to have local support. You can't survive, even in the rural South, on $10 a week, unless somebody's putting you up, giving you food, giving you shelter, all these kinds of things. So it goes together with this notion of building this movement. Now, you were mentioning about Malcolm X and all of that. I mean, that has a lot to do with what happened in the late 1960s, where we kind of lost that sense among, in terms of my own experience. By the time I was very active in the mid-1960s, we were already making a transition to a leader-centered movement, which kind of culminates in the Black Panther Party, where you have people at the top kind of giving orders down to the ranks And that was so contrary. I mean, one of the things that made Snick so strong was that arresting Bob Moses wasn't going to kill the movement. Arresting Huey Newton, the whole movement has to get organized about getting him out of jail. So it was a different kind of movement. Now, with King, I did have, a part of the whole reason why I wrote this book was trying to reconcile Snick with King. And it's hard, because King kind of represents charismatic leadership. Snick, during that time, was very suspicious of that kind of leadership.
The Lord.
Yes,
the Lord.
Right. And I think Snick was right. But I've come to the view that, and it kind of came out of an interview I did with Stokely by the time he was Kwame Ture. And I asked him, like, what did you think of King? And I kind of expected him to talk very negatively of King and nonviolence and all that kind of stuff. And instead, he talked about how much he admired King and how he felt very close to him. And he told me this story about, he said, when I was organizing in Mississippi, and I'd go to the home of a sharecropper, and they would say, are you one of Dr. King's men? And he would say, yes, mine, I am.
That's right.
And that was his approach at that point. And he said that King was the greatest mobilizer, and that what he did in Lowndes County would not have been possible without King. So I think that when you look at it, they both played these essential roles. I think King was the visionary. Bob Moses was the ultimate organizer.
That's a great comment. That's terrific, Clay. I want to take just the second one for just a minute. My mother used to quote Lady Astor as saying that the older generation always says the younger generation's going to the dogs. Well, they ought to know because they've been there themselves. And when we were talking about folks going to Mississippi, we weren't some vast majority of, everybody on the campus. People sort of, sometimes have funny memories about, oh, everybody was out there on the barricades in the 60s. So I think it's important to sort of be clear. And I mean, in my own work, the young people I've privileged to work with over these last years, especially, in the last few years, the Dreamers and the whole immigration reform movement, and the young people that are sort of driving that thing with enormous courage. Young people involved in climate change struggles all over with 350.org and the pipeline. Those are young people doing that. I think that you don't want to get into a historical illusion. And I think the question today is, there's a lot of green shoots out there that need to be encouraged and supported. But they're sure out there. At least it's been my good fortune to meet a whole lot of them and have the privilege to work with them. And I actually think sometimes things skip a generation. I actually think this generation has enormous promise.
Just one adding to that, one of the largest organizations of teachers and it's centered here in the Bay Area, Teachers for Social Justice. I've been to their convention. They have it every year. I think the last one, like 2,000 teachers show up. So that's one of the strong places where you see, and these are mostly young teachers.
So this is, sorry, just a sec. I'm going to say something and then I'm going to give it back to you. This has been an entirely invigorating evening, and I thank you all for being here, and all four of you. It's been very moving, exhilarating, really. Mary is going to have a final word, just a minute, and then Doug is going to have the final word. After which we will give them a big round of applause. So Mary first and then Doug.
I want to share with you a book that will be out in the middle of May. It's from the Wisconsin State Historical Society. It's about the Mississippi Freedom Summer, and it is comprised of documents, actual documents from the summer, Ku Klux Klan documents, Andrew Goodman's application as a volunteer, the Sovereignty Commission, minutes of meetings, because so many of us donated our papers to the Wisconsin State Historical Society. I've got a stack of postcards here that I'll put up on the stage so that you can take it as a reminder for how to order it. I think this is something really remarkable. It's the first such product from our movement. It took 50 years.
Mary, you're making an altar call.
I wanted simply, this is just going to echo what Marshall and Clay said. There is more student activism on campus now than there was in 1963, 64, on the eve of Freedom Summer. Yeah. Things, we look back at the 60s through the lens of 70, 69, 68, where it's true, there was an enormous amount of campus activism around the war, among other issues.
Yeah, the war.
But those were unusual years. There's more student activism today than there was in the early 60s, for sure. So, this generation's doing just fine.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.